Hello BookTube, Books with Banks back again with a pretty quick video today for you all. So I've been tossing around this idea and thinking about this idea a lot in my mind about how artists, specifically authors of fiction, of literature, how these authors are in a way in conversation with each other, and I think a lot of this is evident in how authors of some of our favorite stories might have been inspired by everything that came before. They might be responding to some of the themes in those earlier works. And so I'd just like to kind of do a really quick, or give a really quick example of this with, if anyone's too familiar or super familiar with my channel, my favorite author of all time is Erikson, author of Malazan, Book of the Fallen, book 1 here, Gardens of the Moon. It's a great series if you haven't read it, but it is in and of itself a pretty clear commentary on a lot of the norms and tropes of the fantasy genre, and this came out in like 2001 or somewhere around there, 2001, something like that. So, and all the Book of the Fallen, these were all published in that decade, roughly, like in 2000 to 2011, 2012, somewhere in there. His main series was published for the last 20 years. Erikson and his friend Esselmont have been putting out books in this Malazan world. And I think they've been engaging in the art of writing and creativity, not only as kind of a conversation starter for readers and fans to read these books and then have, literal in-person conversations with each other, maybe on YouTube, maybe in person, wherever. But I think what often gets overlooked is are all of the artistic works that inspired this initial statement. So I guess a more succinct way of saying of kind of visualizing what I'm saying is, if every novel is part of a conversation, let's say it is one author giving, not like they're giving a really long-winded answer to issues and comments others have made before, so that author uses their novel to present their answer and kind of argue that answer, and the various tools they use to get their points across are the characters, the plot, whatever. Specific to that book, and then to continue on that conversation, it's up to kind of the critics and the audience and the readers and even the authors themselves, if they have sequels and stuff coming out, to see what the reaction is to their statement, to their kind of joining this conversation, their them putting their own ideas into this conversation. So for something like Erikson's Malazan, Book of the Fallen, I might in future videos talk about how, what audience reactions have been like to this. I'll look at that part of the, quote-unquote conversation around art. But I want to actually today talk really briefly about what I understand to be a lot of the earlier artists that Erikson was commenting on, taking inspiration from, and I think it's really important to study and to understand our favorite artists' influences and to understand what they're responding to, what they're reacting to when they're structuring their stories in these ways, when they include the types of characters they include. So today, I'm sure there are numerous influences that impacted how Erikson wrote Malazan, Book of the Fallen, but today I'm going to look at 3 different things. One being a work and an author's work that I think helped to influence how Erikson approached certain sets of characters in a series. Another being how Erikson approached his sort of deconstructing, I guess we could say slightly postmodern, but not really, we'll say slightly postmodern approach to the fantasy genre itself. And then last but not least, Erikson's inclusion of the military fantasy subgenre in his Book of the Fallen. So first, let's look at characters. And I think anyone who's familiar with Erikson's Book of the Fallen will recognize that he often has a lot of duos. He has pairs of characters who complement each other very nicely. They can help in dialogue, between action sequences or even during action sequences, to point out each other's flaws, to create a witty repartee and create a banter there, comment on where each of them came from. Very briefly, really, really light spoilers at the beginning of Book 4, House of Chains. We have a character named Karsa Orlong, who is a giant of a man called Tablor in the series, and he finds himself traveling with a smaller, kind of seemingly less powerful, less capable person, and this duo, they play off of each other very, very nicely. And I think Erikson including characters like this, duos like that, they're all throughout a series. I think that was an active response on his part to the works of Fritz Leiber. Here I have the first 2 collections of short stories all about these characters, Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. I just finished reading this one that introduces these 2 of Leiber's characters. Now, these stories were published from like the 1930s through the 1980s, I believe, and actually reading this kind of inspired me to make this video, because in all of the duos Erikson has, from Mappo and Icarium to Tehol and Bug, reading this, I could see a lot of points of connection between how Leiber approached kind of bringing this duo together and setting up their dynamic. I could see Erikson taking that and making several characters and several relationships in his Book of the Fallen epic kind of reflect. What I'm guessing were lessons he learned from reading Fritz Leiber's Fafhrd and Grey Mouser stories. I also know in interviews that Erikson's done, he talks about these stories having influenced a decent amount of, at least the archetype that Erikson will start a character off as. Now then, what's brilliant about Erikson using a series to add on to this conversation that is the fantasy genre is that Erikson will then take those archetypes in totally unexpected directions. Not saying that Leiber didn't take things in unexpected directions, but Erikson's just yet again showing another, even more modern way of approaching character. Again, starting from similar archetypes that Leiber starts from, but just branching things off into new directions. So I'd say these stories, Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser by Fritz Leiber, definitely had a decent amount of an impact on how Erikson wanted to approach character, especially the kind of duo or dynamic duo character set that you see all throughout Book of the Fallen. Next up, I want to look at a series, or talk briefly about a series that I haven't read yet. I've heard great things. I've heard some controversial things, but I have also heard in interviews that Erikson's done that he is responding to and kind of took a lot of inspiration from this author's work. And this would be, of course, Stephen R. Donaldson's Chronicles of Thomas Covenant series, specifically the first trilogy. Here, I'll hold these up so you can see that spine there, a nice ring. I think we all know what's kind of been commented on there, having a ring there. Now, see, I haven't read these, but I can, from what Erikson has said in interviews and that image alone, I can start to already assume that Donaldson is trying to deconstruct the mythic sort of storytelling and heroic, I guess, themes and tone of something like Lord of the Rings, with a series all about a leper character, not a great person. There's nothing particularly virtuous about Thomas Covenant. Again, all from what I understand. And these all came out in the late 70s and the 80s, I believe. And so again, similar to how Leiber was deconstructing character archetypes and demonstrating what a great dynamic duo kind of character development system can look like basically throughout the 20th century. Donaldson apparently was deconstructing a lot of themes that were maybe taken for granted a little bit in the more heroic, mythic fantasy works inspired by things like Lord of the Rings. So Erikson, I think, was building a lot of his themes in the tone of Book of the Fallen, kind of jumping off from this point of, okay, now we've had authors like Donaldson who deconstructed these ideas. What kind of structure, what new thing, what new system can I build my world into? Can I force my characters through? What scenarios can I force them through that don't adhere necessarily to the heroic myths of something like Lord of the Rings, but also that don't go, totally full tilt in abandoning anything heroic and abandoning anything hopeful. So yeah, I think Erikson's Book of the Fallen, very much, he's using this as a kind of a permission, opening of a floodgate, if you will, that now lets him explore his own ideas of how much needs to be deconstructed of the former ideas of the fantasy genre and what fantasy stories look like, into how Erikson is now going to build his own world. Part 2. Then part 3, this one's a little bit more straightforward, but I also understand that Erikson was really inspired to write grittier, more realistic depictions of war and violence and death, and how upsetting and unheroic war and military action actually is. And he was inspired by things like Glenn Cook's Black Company. Also, I don't have a copy of it. I believe he was also inspired by Tim O'Brien's The Things That Carried. Great book. And I think he was inspired by other Vietnam War fiction as well. But that gives, all of this kind of gave Erikson the groundwork to then respond. It gave him the sense of where the current conversation was at in the genre about military action and about whether or not it was heroic, whether it was grim, whether it was nihilistic. And then you can see Erikson jumping off from those same ideas and first exploring those ideas with his group of characters, the Bridge Burners, but eventually building or jumping over kind of, and really, I think, giving a much deeper, more powerful exploration of these same violent, gruesome military depictions and ideas when he gets to his Bone Hunters cast of characters in the later books in his series. So hopefully that wasn't too rambly, hopefully that wasn't too disjointed, but really the main point I just wanted to make is that these are all works that have inspired, I believe have inspired Steven Erikson to write his series in the way that he chose to write it. And I think if we are to understand and truly respect what our favorite authors are trying to accomplish, we have to understand the artists they are responding to. So I have begun that journey by reading Leiber's stuff. I plan on reading Donaldson's stuff soon, and Cook's stuff as well. And again, these are just a few of the examples of things that might have inspired Erikson to write his own fantasy stories. I'm sure there's plenty more. Something I didn't mention, Erikson's also talked about how, like, Frank Herbert went about introducing his world and world building elements in his Dune series. Erikson said he took some inspiration from that, at least structurally. I don't want to go on too long, but I love Malazan Book of the Fallen, and now I think if I read these, I can teach myself, or I can come to have a better understanding of why I love that series so much, and exactly what context Erikson was writing in, what he was responding to. All that said, thank you so much for watching. Have a great day. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe. Thanks. Bye.